edition of World Crisis Radio. This is your host, Webster Tarpley, speaking from Washington, D.C. It's the afternoon of Friday, the 6th of April, 2018, and we're getting certain harbingers of spring here in Washington, D.C. The cherry blossoms are at their peak, and they may be a little bit past peak. So this is the last weekend to come and see your tax dollars at work at the reflecting pool. And remember, the Jefferson Memorial, I suppose we have to tolerate, but the Franklin D. Roosevelt Memorial, keep walking around the reflecting pool and go and take a look at one that is not so well known. It's newer, but it's excellent, and the historical learning there is very, very good, because this is free of mythology. It's not like the attempt to make Thomas Jefferson look good. Anyway, here we are. It's springtime in Washington, D.C. Now, we are in the midst of converging crises. There's no other way to put it. We are now in a crisis of the great powers. We have an ongoing crisis of the regime here in Washington, D.C., and this has military overtones. It also has trade war overtones, and that is the overwhelming reality here all around us. And we're going to try to make sense out of it. Now, the main underlying point is going to be this. Trump, of course, as a profoundly disturbed and dysfunctional individual, lashes out in all directions, or at least it seemed like it was all directions except Russia and China. Now, during the month of March, he has begun, or at least he has not blocked, I would say, he has not blocked certain moderately significant moves against Russia and China. Now, these are of the character of defense. As long as the United States was an aggressor, attacking countries like Iraq or Libya or Syria, we were against it. This phase, however, has now been superseded by the current phase, which sees the U.S. largely on the defensive. The opprobrium of aggression now resides in Moscow and in Beijing, and you've got to understand this. Political analysis is the attempt to make meaningful statements about reality. The trick about reality is that it's always changing. So, of course, what you said 10 years ago, 5 years ago, or yesterday may now be superseded by new statements that are attempting to reflect the reality around you. So that's extremely important. Now, therefore, we have ongoing conflicts, both military, strategic, and economic, with both Russia and China. This is now the three-cornered world. And just remember what you're dealing with here. You're dealing, in effect, with two totalitarian dictatorships, more and more. And they are aggressive. They are hostile. They are angry. They are significantly motivated by their own failures, and they want to take that out on the U.S. And, of course, we have a fifth column inside the U.S. The fifth column of anti-Americanism includes the anti-government libertarians who hate all forms of government and who hate, therefore, this one. And we have the anti-Americanism of the mushhead liberals who, impressed by misdeeds over the years, which undoubtedly have occurred, somehow are not able to adjust their attitude to a time when, again, the aggression is incoming, not outgoing from here. So they are anti-American too. and therefore the alt-left and the alt-right join hands against this country in the service of these totalitarian dictators abroad, right? They are the running dogs of Moscow and Beijing. So let's just take a quick look now. What we have generally, these are the headings. We have an incipient trade war with China beginning. We have a latent military conflict with China in the South China Sea. We've got a face-off where, as we've been calling attention to, the Chinese Navy has sent a flotilla, the Grand Fleet, the Chinese High Seas Fleet, or Blue Water Fleet, of 40 vessels, including an aircraft carrier. These are not the most capable vessels, but there they are, and they are certainly, the appearance is formidable. And we've got the possibility that the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the aircraft carrier, may find itself close to those Chinese vessels. Anyway, they're sailing around. I think they're near Hainan Island right now. Their goal is to interfere with freedom of navigation in that part of the world. And we're hearing that European countries, European navies may now decide to undertake their own freedom of navigation activities in this part of the world. That would be highly interesting. The European Union head of security policy, François Rivasseau, R-A-V-A-S-S-E-A-U. François Rivasseau tells the Australian Financial Review that European navies will not, they cannot exclude the idea that freedom of navigation patrols by European countries in the South China Sea cannot be ruled out. Okay? So these are, in other words, what he's saying is possible. Right now you have a cooperation of U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, a formidable coalition, as well as possibly Britain. They're not in it yet. They ought to get into it because they're suspect, right? We've got Global Britain, the banker for Beijing. No, that will not do. You're going to lose a lot on that one. That's a losing bet for the British, right? Forget about Brexit and focus on meeting your NATO and EU requirements. So this is the situation in the South China Sea, and you can speculate about this a great deal. Where is it going? But that's number one. We're also told that this new Chinese aircraft carrier is not exactly the most modern. You'll remember that this is essentially something that the Soviets started. They built the hull. The Chinese bought it when it was essentially stopped. Well, this is now going around. We're told that it's not up to the international standard of the U.S. carrier battle groups. But again, don't kid yourself. The Liaoning, it does training, and of course it is retrofitted. So that's the problem with that. But it's there. So a face-off is certainly possible. You've got the Theodore Roosevelt joined by the guided missile cruiser USS Bunker Hill, guided missile destroyer USS Sampson, and some other ships. So we got to watch that, right? And this is the freedom of the seas, right? Freedom of navigation for all nations, essential U.S. foreign policy point since 1783. Back in a minute on World Crisis. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of April. Our show today, of course, free for all. We also recommend that you subscribe to the American System. Go to AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. There are a number of topics as you listen today that I can only refer to because we've done complete expositions on that daily program. Right? We have much more flexibility to treat complex topics. And one of them was about the question of tariffs and trade, and we've done other in-depth studies. Just go to AmericanSystem.tv and check those headlines, and you'll see that this stuff is eminently worth knowing. All right, so we've got a possible military confrontation with China. I put that up front because it's generally neglected. And we've got the $100 billion in additional, let's phrase this carefully, as of yesterday evening, Thursday, the Trump, in his inimitable, haphazard, erratic way, said, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to add another $100 billion." So what does he mean by that? Does he mean $100 billion in tariff income as the result of a tax? In other words, is that tariff revenue for the U.S.? That would be an awful lot. That would be about 1/3 or 1/4 of the entire bilateral trade. So I don't think he means that. I think he means tariffs on $100 billion of Chinese merchandise. And interestingly, he already said tariff on $50 billion. The Chinese matched that with $50 billion of their own. And then the next step, of course, was this $100 billion. And this is quite singular because the Chinese are going to run out of U.S. trade that they can put tariffs on. See, the U.S. buys, what, $500 billion from China every year? The Chinese buy a measly $130 billion in U.S. production. So if you do 50 and then you match that with 100, you've already gone beyond the trade that exists there. So they can't do it. There's now speculation. What will China do next? They might retaliate if they claim that they want to have a mirroring or tit for tat. They could devalue their currency, the renminbi. They could dump U.S. Treasury securities. That, of course, would make them a lot of very serious enemies among other countries that hold U.S. Treasury securities, not least of which is Japan. They'd also be shooting themselves in the foot, since the biggest holder of those Treasury bonds is still China. They could also keep U.S. companies out of their internal market, might limit access to U.S. firms. They've already done that to a very significant degree. So that's an interesting predicament. What we have to point out, though, is the extreme instability of the Chinese government. In other words, the social contract there is something like this. The Chinese population will put up with the oppressive, stupid, ham-handed Communist Party bureaucracy, which tramples on individuals' property, all sorts of things, right? We don't need to go through the whole catalog. And, of course, carries out these outrageous human rights violations where some of the leading human rights activists have been, they've turned up dead in recent months. And 300 have been arrested, and the whereabouts of not all of them fully known, at least from day to day. There's always the idea that if the Chinese government does not deliver on a reasonable standard of living and some idea of economic progress, they could be overthrown. They could face internal revolution. They would certainly be ripe for a color revolution if somebody wanted to inflict that on them. They are not popular. They are not beloved. You look at Xi. Is that charismatic? Right? Xi Dada, Uncle Xi. I don't think so. And, of course, they've got to do all of this totalitarian stuff, block the Internet, Great Wall of China, all of these things. So there's a vulnerability there. And you can say, yeah, well, if there's a trade war, different countries may suffer. The one that's most likely to suffer, I believe, is China, because it is the one that is most unstable. It has the least internal resilience in terms of its political system, because its political system is ipso facto illegitimate. It's not the result of elections. It's the result of this secret haggling and conniving and what do you want to call it? Corruption of the really infamous Chinese Communist Party, right? The ones who brought you the Great Leap Forward with 20 million dead, the Bloom and Contend 100 Flowers campaign with 10 million dead there, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, on and on and on, the struggles around Lin Biao, the Gang of Four, on and on. They are not legit, and as long as they're bringing home the bacon, they can hang on. But this is a very, very scary thing for them. So that's the situation there with China. We'll talk more about some of these tariffs and trade questions. But now with Russia, we just had the three Baltic states come here to Washington, D.C. These are countries that have had a rough time because destiny has put them between Russia, Soviet Union in their east, Germany, Federal Republic or Reich in the west, and they have, again, suffered significantly from being in that unfortunate position. And the three of them, obviously alarmed by Trump's appeasement policies, came to Washington this past week, and it was essentially an appeal for support and an appeal not to be betrayed, bargained away by Trump in the way that Chamberlain, the arch appeaser at the Munich Conference 80 years ago, bargained away the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. So here they were, and we just want to follow that up because this gets us into the conflict with Russia, which is also increasingly evident. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. This is our Saturday program, release broadcast on Saturday. We're live on tape from Friday afternoon. And we also encourage you to get in on the American System. That's americansystem.tv, and that's at 9 o'clock every evening, 1 hour. So please subscribe to that. It's well worth the effort to do that, and of course a mere bagatelle in terms of costs. So the three Baltic leaders were here. So here we are, 80 years after the Munich sellout of September 1938, right? 1938, 2018, 80 years. And, of course, that was Sir Neville Chamberlain, Daladier, selling out Czechoslovakia to Hitler under the chairmanship of Mussolini, and so forth. So that's 80 years ago. We'll mark that one abundantly. But now we have the presidents, the heads of state of the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, show up at the White House. And what they're looking for is reassurance. And what do they get from Trump? You'd expect him to say, we are allies under the North Atlantic Treaty. We have a mutual defense obligation under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. And we've also understood the necessity, because of Russian behavior, to keep tripwire forces in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, similar to what exists now in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. That would be military forces that are in no way capable of threatening Russia. Limited military forces, but forces that are substantial enough so that if you overrun them and kill them all, you will be at war with the United States. Just that simple. So don't do it. If you're going to choose war, don't choose war, because you're not going to have aggression without war. This is the lesson of Munich, right? That appeasement, as Machiavelli had argued, appeasement does not get you peace. It gets you war later, and you're weaker. You're in a more disadvantaged position, because the concessions you make towards appeasement make you weaker. Big example, 1938, the Czech army and fortifications, 30 to 40 divisions with a kind of little Maginot Line, would have been a tremendous problem for the German military. It would have taken months, years, casualties, plenty of time for the world to unite against Hitler. But they were sold out. So they came, the redoubtable Lithuanian president, Grybauskaitė, said, we came looking for leadership, even erratic, no, what did she say? Even unpredictable leadership. In other words, we'll take any kind of leadership that we want from you. And of course, Trump strikes out. Trump, in his heart of hearts and even skin deep, he's an appeaser. He's in the tradition of Sir Neville Chamberlain. He believes in groveling, in propitiation. He's a coward. This is evident. So that had already happened. Now, one day after that, they came to the White House on Monday. One day after that, on Tuesday, the Russians decide that they need to have a big series of rocket tests in the Baltic. And this involves this exclave, right? This is a piece of the Russian Federation which is physically separated from the rest of it. So it's an exclave from the Russian point of view. It's an enclave from the Polish point of view, because that's the country that's around it. And I guess it's an enclave from the German point of view, although that maybe you can debate. So all kinds of rockets are getting launched from this area of Kaliningrad. This, of course, is the old German city of Königsberg, which had been the home of Immanuel Kant, right, the famous philosopher, right? You could set your watch by Kant as he took his daily walk, right? He was so methodical. So that's Kaliningrad, and that's part of the Russian Federation. Fine. We have no beef with that. But what the Latvians then had to do was to close their airspace for a whole day. If you had, plans for tourism in the Baltic or shipments, trade, commerce, medical supplies, maybe urgent. No, got to close the airspace because Russia is shooting off rockets. This could not be more ham-handed. And then, in addition to this, we get more unfriendly action from Russia vis-a-vis the United States. And this is the issue. The U.S. and South Korea traditionally hold these military exercises. You have to, because the North Korean People's Army is in a very aggressive posture. It is not arrayed in defensive positions behind trenches and barbed wire. It is in an offensive position, right? It's ready to strike. And when the U.S. military in South Korea says, be ready to fight tonight, it means you have to be ready. And it's defensive. It's not an attack. It's defense. These are very important distinctions between aggression, attack, and defense, right? Which is not to be equated with aggression. It's self-defense. So that's why, and there are the position of the Beijing, the Xi dynasty in Beijing, as well as the neo-oligarchs in the Kremlin. They all say, no, we have to have the U.S. and South Korea stop their defensive drills in South Korea and not do that anymore. And that's, of course, one of the demands of Madman Kim of the Kim dynasty. The Kim dynasty of Korea, another communist dynasty, is the joint production of Moscow and Beijing. Some see Beijing as far more important, and it certainly is very important. But those missiles that Kim now has, those are SS-18s. Those are Soviet missiles manufactured in the old USSR in Ukraine. And that's where they've gotten from to come now to North Korea. So here we go. Russia now says U.S. must halt military activity on the Korean Peninsula. This is, not one day after the Baltics show up at the White House, but a couple of days, right? In the same week, Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement Thursday calling on the United States to immediately halt all military activity on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. is currently engaged in joint military operations with South Korea. In other words, they're spring exercises, right? That's the way it works. And the Russians say these joint exercises are not helping in ongoing efforts to try to reduce military tensions in Korea. These have been a problem every year. This is not as bad as some years. North Korea has led up on this, right? That's part of the promise moving towards this supposed summit. But Moscow says you should stop doing that. I would say to Moscow, why did you deliver SS-18s? Why did you proliferate Soviet missile technology, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of bringing weapons of mass destruction to the United States? And now you turn around and say, no, start whining about these essentially conventional defensive drills on the Korean Peninsula in the fate of a very aggressive enemy. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis. Back to World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now, the background. Well, no, there's one more. Sorry. Before we get to that background, we've got to talk now about the sanctions that were issued today, this morning, by the Trump administration, and I use this term advisedly. I really wonder, I'll tell you what I think in a minute, but I don't see Trump as being the prime mover behind any of this. I think Trump is essentially, in his weakened state, in his highly impeachable, vulnerable, erratic state, where he's essentially focusing on playing to the base, right? Playing to his fanatical followers, right? This group of embittered and isolated people. I think he's had less and less to do with this. I would say the campaign to expel Russian diplomats as a first sanction or response, I would say that was a Parthian shot by outgoing Secretary of State Tillerson. That is a Parthian shot. You know, this is famous, right? The Roman Empire had to deal with the Parthian Empire, and they were very impressed by the way that the Parthian cavalry could be riding away from you, and they could be shooting with their bows and arrows in the opposite direction. So they're retreating and departing, but they're able to hit you hard with a barrage of arrows because they can turn themselves around in the saddle. So I think a funny metaphor maybe, but this is the term. Tillerson. The news of 28 countries kicking out 150 or so Russian diplomats, that news broke on a Monday. And we have the famous quote from French President Macron saying, let's announce it Monday at 3 o'clock European time, which they did. I don't think Trump had anything to do with that. I think that was an end run, the bureaucratic term popularized by Kissinger and many another bureaucratic player here in Washington, is you do an end run. You don't go through somebody, you go around them, of course. You outflank them inside the bureaucracy. So I would say that was an end run, and it was a Parthian shot by Tillerson with help from General McMaster. And that was a couple of weeks ago now, but now we have the continuation. U.S. government has sanctioned 7 Russian oligarchs, 17 Russian government officials, and a significant number, I think we've got 14 firms, or at least a dozen firms, controlled by these oligarchs especially. They are facing their assets being frozen, and they cannot do normal economic transactions with the United States. Right? It's clear that they will not be able to travel in the United States. And let me just remind everybody, right, from the Christopher Steele dossier. The Christopher Steele dossier goes through what was the debate inside the Kremlin about whether to meddle in the U.S. And some of them were in favor of it. Some of them were against it. One of them who was against it was Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who said, I don't want to do this because after I retire and leave government, I want to be able to travel in the U.S. I want to have a home in the U.S. I want to feel free to move around the U.S. I don't want to do this. This is what means something to Russian oligarchs, Medvedev being a prime example. So, assets frozen, activities shut down, financial access made much more difficult, companies becoming radioactive. Some of these companies that were named today on the list, they've lost 5 or 10% of their value, typically on the London stock market. And so these are important sanctions. A dozen companies, including a state-owned arms company, a bank, and others have been hit. Now, I don't think Trump did this, not in a million years, right? Trump's mind is on Trump Tower, Moscow, Trump Tower, St. Petersburg, who knows where else. This is Trump. I think this is McMaster, because we're told that today is the last day on the job of General McMaster. He will be now leaving the White House in a couple of hours here at the close of business. McMaster had made a statement, a speech yesterday at one of the think tanks saying that the United States response to Russian meddling in the 2016 elections was a failure. So whatever you think of McMaster, right, and this is somebody who has stood up to Trump. He's done something here, I think. And what does it include? Well, Putin's son-in-law, or because of the characteristic Byzantine veil of secrecy around the imperial family here, Kirill Shamalov, allegedly Putin's son-in-law, married, we think, the West consensus seems to be, that Shamalov is the husband of Katerina Tikhonova. Now, you may have seen her. This is actually very interesting. Tikhonova is a practitioner of acrobatic rock and roll. Now, I had never heard of acrobatic rock and roll until I saw the YouTube tape of Tikhonova. And there she is, right? So it's a kind of rock and roll jitterbug with sort of extreme acrobatics. What else can you say? And that seems to be her thing. Now, I would wonder, You know, we're told that the Putin family, that Putin personally is under the influence of this Father Tikhon of the Russian Orthodox Church, that's his guru. Some say it's his Rasputin. Tikhonova, no, I don't think there's no connection here necessarily. But the daughter, if you're going to have a Russophile culture, then you'd think that the daughter, what would the daughter be doing? She'd be learning the Polovtsian dances from the opera Prince Igor by Borodin, or she'd be learning the dances of the Don Cossacks or something like this. But instead, she takes a more decadent version. The rock and roll part, right, is already decadent from the Russian point of view, and they may have a case. But then even more decadent is going to be the acrobatic version. So what does that tell us about the culture? How seriously can you take this Slavophile culture if the daughter turns out to be, well, you see, doing these things, right? What does that? What can we conclude? We don't know. So so this is one. Now this guy Shapalov, he's an oligarch in his own right? I think he's involved in banking, and we're going to give you a further rundown of these targets and sanctions. The second hour of World Crisis Radio. It's the 6th of April as we record Friday afternoon. And spring-like Washington, D.C., cherry blossoms going. Last chance. If you want to see them, you've got to come this weekend because the gale may arrive even overnight. We may have something that will disturb the show. And here we are. We want you to tune in Monday through Thursday to the American System, AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. So we're going through these very interesting sanctions on individual Russian oligarchs. Now, I don't know, these alt-left characters, right? They go through this song and dance about how they don't like the idea of essentially warding off Russian interference, right? They think that's all a pretext. They think that's all made up by the CIA. Well, look, these are oligarchs, right? There's no doubt about that. You can't argue that these are humanitarians or agrarian reformers or well-meaning revolutionaries, even if they've gone astray. No. These are money-grubbing, predator, parasite oligarchs. They're as bad or worse than anything in Wall Street. So what's the objection? What's the beef? If you're a leftist, right, how are you going to be against calling some of these oligarchs to account in a system that goes from the power ministries to the sort of normal commercial thievery of predatory financiers and bloodsuckers, all the way over to the mafia-type oligarchs, right? To the ultimate term of comparison out here would be the Mogilovich world of oligarchy. So, who gets hit? Now, we mentioned Putin's son-in-law, right, Shapalov. We believe, let's say, we think there are some accounts out today that say that Mogilovich is, that Shapalov is perhaps no longer married to Putin's daughter. We don't know that, right? We're just going by published accounts. So this is this guy's activity. Shapovalov, this is essentially oil. Right? This is Kirill Shamalov, minority shareholder with the petrochemical company Sibur. Shamalov, according to Reuters, married Putin's youngest daughter Katerina in 2013, but unconfirmed media reports since say they have split. You got to get the National Enquirer of Russia if you can. How about Oleg Deripaska? Oleg Deripaska. This is probably right now the best known of these Russian oligarchs because that's the guy who is widely reported to have been working with Paul Manafort and Rick Gates of the Trump campaign. Therefore, we might say with the Trump campaign in the person of those individuals. And his big deal is aluminum. So he was hit hard. Let's just see. There are all kinds of suits going on against them, even in New York State. A Cyprus-based company tied to Deripaska sued Manafort and Gates. Anyway, this stuff we know, but it gets you right into the middle of that. There's a company called EN Plus Group, that is capital E, capital N, and the plus sign group. This manages Deripaska's aluminum and hydroelectric power assets. It ended down 21% today on the London Stock Exchange. Now, that ain't hay. That's going to get their attention. Let's see if we can mention some others. By the way, look at the Reuters article on this. They've got nice pictures of all these characters. One is a guy, I believe he's a former Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister, Mikhail Fradkov. There are any number. We have this guy, Vekselberg. Vekselberg is a big deal. He's the owner of the Renova Holding Group. Forbes magazine says Vekselberg is the 9th richest businessman, infamous for bringing a collection of Fabergé eggs to Russia. So these are Les Oeufs Fabergé, the jeweler in Paris, the imperial family, Tsar Nicholas II, when he was still alive, and the Tsarina, and maybe Rasputin in the background. They got these eggs designed, right? Fantastic, gold, jewels, all this stuff. And they'd have those for presents among themselves in the Easter season. So look at that. So we have Deripaska, we have Shamalov, we have this Vekselberg here. The gas exporter, Gazprom, this is what sells gas to Western Europe through the pipelines, right? Alexei Miller, written Miller, like Arthur Miller. Alexei Miller, CEO of Gazprom, says he's proud to be targeted. He had an identity crisis when he was not on the first list. What's wrong with me? But now I'm on there, and I can tell you that we're doing everything right, meaning spreading oligarchy, because that's what they spread, right? Don't kid yourself. There's no positive social content left here. So let's see if we can look at some others. Vladimir Bogdanov, Suleiman Kerimov, he's a fairly important one. Shamalov, we said. Vekselberg, Fradkov, we've mentioned. Sergei Fursenko, Alexei Dyumin, Vladimir Kolokoltsev, Konstantin Kozachev, Andrei Kostin, Alexei Miller, and some others, okay? Rusal, the Russian aluminum company, fell 10% on according to Reuters. Douglas Jacobson, an attorney with Jacobson Burton Kelly in Washington, said most international banks rooted in the West would now shy away from making loans to the companies targeted by the U.S. in this Friday list. These companies are now radioactive, and they will be selling. The Treasury Department said you have until May 7th to divest any stocks, bonds, or holdings of these Russian companies, EN Plus, Gazprom, Rusal. And for some of the other ones named, you're allowed to get out of your contracts with them in the next 60 days. So we will have, obviously, more about this. But I would say this is positive and encouraging, so much so that I'm sure Trump didn't do it. Can't be Trump. It's got to be a parting gift, a Parthian shot, an end run by McMaster on his last day on the job. Yes, indeed. And it indicates that since McMaster is a lieutenant general and wants to go back to the Pentagon and continue being a lieutenant general, he eventually wants to become a 4-star full general. He's doing this, I think, with a significant institutional support. In other words, you couldn't do this unless somebody like Mattis were in substantial agreement. So there we have at least the first sketch of these important and positive and encouraging economic sanctions, not against the poor Russian peasant or worker, but against these evil oligarchs. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. And just a couple of other sidelights on this list of oligarchs who are getting, at least having their assets frozen, or shortly will if they don't get out of town. I can imagine McMaster saying, "Look, either you let me put this through, or, of course, you can fire me. But then when I'm on the outside, I'm going to tell all." And Trump would say, "No, don't tell all. You've learned some stuff while you're here. I don't want you to go public on me." So individuals and businesses associated with the energy sector, Gazprom in particular, some of them are tied very much to Putin. That would include Kirill Shamalov, son-in-law, quite possibly, oil sector, Igor Rotenberg, son of Arkady Rotenberg, Putin's boyhood friend from St. Petersburg, Andrei Kostin, he's VTB Bank. He heads the second largest bank, which is state-controlled, so he's been hit. Alexei Miller, we've been going through that. This is Gazprom. Miller and Kostin are longtime key associates of Putin. Some of the others are not so close to Putin, but they're part of this group of, 100 oligarchs, something like this. That's the ruling class of Russia. There's 100 oligarchs, not the people, not the people's commissars, not the party, not the Central Committee, but 100 oligarchs. That's what you're dealing with now. So this, I think, is an important step. Now, there will be retaliation, I believe, unless they decide that this entire avenue of attack is not worth it, which I would urge them to do, by the way. This is not worth it. What you've done is what Yamamoto said to look out for. You have now, or you're in the process, let's say, you may be in the process of awakening a sleeping giant and filling him with a terrible resolve. That's, I think, what has been accomplished. And what they can see from this is this lunatic crackpot idea that you could put a puppet like Trump into the White House and then have him do what you want. It is a misconception of the form of government. In other words, even in foreign policy, there are checks and balances, right? There is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There is the House International Affairs, where they have to vote money for things, and if they don't start it, then it won't get voted, and on, right? There is public opinion. There are media, right? There are these other countervailing things. You can see Trump went very far down the road with Russia, right? How far, we don't know, but too far, very far. And what he's telling people around him now is, how can I be president under these conditions? This is impossible. There's a new headline every day. Treason here, collusion here, sellout here, appeasement here. Hey, look, Trump, you buttered your bread. Now you're going to have to sleep in it, right? As the Marx Brothers said way back when, if you didn't want to be subject to that, why were you negotiating for Trump Tower in Moscow in the middle of your presidential campaign? This just makes absolutely no sense. What did you expect? You think you were going to get absolute power so you could corrupt absolutely? It doesn't work that way. And for the Russians, they should have known that, right? They should have known that the attempt to go for this decapitation of the U.S. and put on this talking head, no, it won't work. And what it's likely to do is what I hope it's doing, which is to generate a backlash, which is overwhelming and will make the authors of this thing rue the day. Once again, we're not in favor of conflicts beyond what is necessary. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with an appeasement situation, you've got to make clear that you don't intend to be an appeaser. What the Russians need to do is stop all interference right now. Just call it off. Shut down the Internet Research Agency. So take this entire Cozy Bear, Fancy Bear, Guccifer, shut that down, break it up, end it. End it. Dismantle the apparatus. Issue a formal apology to the United States detailing what was done. And punish those responsible. For example, we have the oligarch Prigozhin, who's implicated in the Internet Research Agency, and the possible attack on U.S. and Kurdish forces in Syria. Punish him. Put him on trial. Right? You've got the list from Mueller. Start from that. Add some, subtract a few, whatever you got. Keep the oligarch, though. And you will be on that right track. Because then you could say, okay, now that you've done that, let's get back to negotiation. Now, notice, I'm not saying anything about Ukraine. I'm not saying anything about Crimea or Donetsk and Lugansk. I don't share the U.S. Media approach to that problem, and I don't share the approach to Syria. I think that the U.S. allies, the U.S. has made some terrible choices under the leadership of neocons or quasi-neocons to ally with these extremely dubious forces, Poroshenko and his backers in Lvov, Lemberg. No, not interested in them. Can't get interested in their cause. That's one place where the Western Europeans can do something if they want to. And then also in Syria, indeed, the U.S. has been cursed by the people that we've ended up with until we got the Kurds. As long as it was the Free Syrian Army, we see what they're worth. They're worth nothing. They're essentially a puppet of Turkey and these essentially Al-Qaeda, Nusra, whatever they call themselves this month. Those were also absolutely poisoned. So the U.S. has finally ended up with some viable allies. But General Votel was asked at hearings recently, General Votel, this is the commander of the CENTCOM, General Votel, do you believe that the U.S. goal is still to overthrow Assad as president of Syria? And he said, frankly, Senator, I don't know. Good. Leave it at that. Just leave it, fudge it. You don't have to go any further. Just lay off. Right? Lay off. So we have all this. Now, there is volatility. Yes, volatility in the markets today. And we'll have the rundown on volatility as a result of trade war when we come back here in 8 minutes. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. Actually, before we get to that pre-announced topic, let's just take a further look at China. Right? Trump said yesterday evening, he talked about what we think means tariffs on $100 billion of Chinese goods being sent to the U.S., right, being sold to the U.S. We did, by the way, on Wednesday and Thursday, we did an in-depth thing. We went through, even read part of the catalog of what is being hit with tariffs, taxed in effect, right? And in terms of goods going from the U.S. to China, it's a lot of it is this colonial-style agricultural stuff, nuts, wine, and then soybeans. And the whole problem of the 19th century in the U.S. is you cannot run your trade policy based on the needs of the agricultural sector. You can't do it. Modern civilization depends on industrialization, technology, factories, science, industry. And you got to key it to that. As far as your agricultural sector, and we're for this, you provide support prices. In other words, you're going to save the farmers. The soybean farmers have got to be saved by the United States Department of Agriculture coming in there and saying, guess what? Here's the support price. It's above your cost of production. Produce what you want. We'll buy it as needed. You will survive. And then you use that for food stamps, food aid, food for peace, and so forth. And everybody can survive. But you cannot have an Iowa farmer saying, hey, wait a minute, we demand free trade for the whole country because that's the way we can survive. No. That was essentially the demand of the Confederacy, saying, hey, we demand free trade because we have slaves, we have cotton, we're going to sell cotton and tobacco and a few other things, maybe some rice. We want to sell that on the world market. The only way we can is if we have free trade. No. It's got to be keyed to the most advanced sectors, advanced manufacturing, plasma physics, space, and the other areas, artificial intelligence and biomedical research, right? That whole complex. That's your growth sector. And, of course, you want to add categories to that as the world goes on. So let's see. What does the Chinese government say? Ministry of Commerce, quote, we will immediately fight back with a major response, says the Chinese government. We have no choice. Yeah, you do have a choice. Look, how can you sit there and say, well, China has a right to run a $300 billion trade surplus vis-a-vis the U.S.? This is blood-sucking. I'm sorry. That's a vampire talking, right? We're going to wreck your industrial economy. We're going to impoverish your population, and we have no choice but to fight back. How about this? According to the same spokesperson, we feel America is very arrogant. Arrogant. After swallowing this for decades, they have taken a wrong action. The result is that they will hurt themselves. If they release the list of 100 billion in tariffs, China is prepared and will not hesitate. We have prepared with a bottom line mindset and have planned detailed action. We won't start a war, but if someone else does, we will definitely fight that conflict. So, no. And by the way, a nameless, faceless bureaucrat from the Ministry of Commerce, this does not indicate great resolution. In other words, I can sense they realize what their big vulnerability is, that they could be faced with upheavals. Right? I once heard an official of the old East Germany, right, the German Democratic Republic, and he said, we have to keep the living standard up, otherwise there are going to be riots. That's essentially the predicament of the Chinese government, because they cannot appeal to constitution or freedom or authority or respect, right? They're essentially a gang of thieves. And the thing, though, is, this is where we've got to point out, it's okay, Trump is doing these things. We'll get to Trump in a minute. But if you want to do this successfully, you're dealing with a plan called Made in China 2025. You're also dealing with this so-called Belt and Road or Belt and Road Forum, BARF. and you're dealing with planning. You're dealing with something formidable. In other words, they have a plan. Trump guaranteed has no plan. Trump is hipshot, erratic, haphazard, whatever. If you want to do this seriously, what do? First of all, internally, you build a domestic political coalition. You get out there and give serious speeches about why free trade is bad. You go through some of the statistics. You get friendly journalists to go out and run a campaign. You get some professors, and it can't be troglodytes. It can't be cavemen and yahoos and loony birds, right? It can't be Larry Kudlow with God knows what vapors in his head. It's got to be somebody serious, right? Making a serious case also historically, right? Some of us could contribute. But, Lincoln, McKinley, you look at the U.S. from the Civil War to World War I. It's all based on protection, dirigism, we would say. So you've got to have a campaign for public opinion, and you've got to win over large parts of the population. You probably start with unions, but you've got to show it to financiers also, saying, guys, you're going like there's no tomorrow, and if you don't turn away from this free trade nonsense, there will be no tomorrow. So domestically, you've got to build it up as a serious case. Not that you're a wild man responding to the most backward elements in society and desperate to keep in power, right? In other words, he's done everything wrong from the very beginning, right? The hating stuff, the xenophobia, the racism, all the, Nazis in Charlottesville, all wrong, all discredited, right? The guy, he couldn't put through any policy, right? I'm sorry. The other thing you have to do is to say, we need a whole bunch of allies. In other words, we've got to organize what amounts to the civilized world to be against globalization and against free trade, globaloney. And we've got to do that. We can start with NATO and the European Union. We've got to support those. We've got to get more people into European Union in particular. The opposite of what this clown has done. Then, in the Far East, right, there's this thing where Kudlow just lately said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had a group of about a dozen important countries in the Asia-Pacific who would be with us? Yeah, that was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And you could have reformed that from the inside during the negotiations if you hadn't been in such a big hurry with Bannon and so forth to do it. In other words, these people have no idea of the importance of allies. Allies. You've got to have them. That's true for anybody, because no matter how big you are, right, you can be China and the rest of the world is still a hell of a lot bigger than you are. So you're going to need allies. So this group haven't done it. Now, in terms of Trump, here's what we're hoping for. We wanted to quote a couple of things, right? Hegel, right? Hegel, much despised, but still some interesting ideas. Hegel talks about the cunning of reason. Now, this is his strange way of talking about actual historical events, but he says the cunning of reason is that certain individuals are going to be used, in spite of themselves sometimes, to get certain things done in the course of world history. For example, Napoleon was the guy who ended feudalism, but did this for the wrong reasons, and it led to his downfall. And that we have to hope, in terms of the free trade globaloney, that Trump can do serious damage to this free trade regime, and then be cast aside. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. We're to our last segment here once again. So fast is the world process going. But once again, the cunning of reason. So it means that certain people play a role that goes far beyond the way they understand themselves. Or sometimes it's the opposite even, right? You think you're doing one thing. You think you're going to reform the Soviet Union and you destroy it. Like that would be Gorbachev, I'm pretty sure. The example that's interesting is Napoleon. Now, we have a very dark view of Napoleon, right? Napoleon is a warmonger. He's a butcher, right? He's always getting people killed in these wars. Ultimately, that's what destroyed his popularity inside France. But the thing that Napoleon did was to spread the French Revolution throughout Europe in a way that the French Revolution by itself could not do. So spread the French Revolution throughout Europe meant that the Rhine, and there were significant parts of Germany, were incorporated into France, metropolitan France, as well as significant parts of Italy, right? Genoa, Florence, Rome, and Trieste and that coast, right? The Dalmatian coast of what is today Yugoslavia, the Adriatic. That was all part of France. So under Napoleon, the French domination brings the destruction of feudalism. And I just want to make this point. In other words, this was not his goal. He said, I want to get reforms because I want these places. I want to conquer these places. I want to hold them. But in spite of himself, he's got to implement anti-feudal reforms because this is the way to get support for himself. And he could therefore present himself as being just, modern, enlightened, indeed the Enlightenment, the rationalist, universalist outlook of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. So what did he do? He wrote to his brother. Ironically, he's making his brother the king of parts of Germany. He says, we have to be open to people who are not noble, but who do have ability. So it means the career open to talents. No serfdom, no feudal powers. All get rid of all of that. Have the Code Napoleon. He said, this is egalitarian. Who will go with the Prussians and their dictatorial rule once they have tasted a wise and liberal administration? In Germany, in France, in Italy, Spain, equality and liberal ideas are trump and dominant. And the cackling of the privileged classes is getting to be increasingly hated. So, Napoleon's reforms were directed against everything feudal. They gave you the legal equality of individuals, all of them, in theory. Government can be more powerful vis-a-vis individual subjects. Whole legal classes, the estates wiped out. Careers open to talent instituted everywhere. The manorial system, serfdom, manorial fees, special feudal taxes, the right to make serfs work for you, all gone, swept away. Now, of course, he did this because he wanted military power, right? This was a way to, and not only in the countryside, guilds abolished or gutted, the right to work, free labor, generally proclaimed. He could do this quite far east. By the time you get to the Elbe, though, he sees that on the other side of the Elbe, right, east of Germany, there's a lot of, there's just a lot of feudal oligarchs, and you can get rid of the system, but these people are still there, right? So the idea is the rule in these places is that the feudal lord is gone, but the landlord remains. In other words, the same power relations under these different legal forms. So that's what it is. Now, in terms of Trump is now headed for a conflict with China. This is fairly obvious. He has to be because of this. Then, apparently, this was the plan, right? This is what he actually was working towards with Bannon and with Trump. Of course, would have been nice to have allies, huh, guys? Would have been nice to do a serious preparation. So these people are bunglers. No reform will succeed with people of this low quality, because it's essentially this is like the fruits of mental disturbance. Don is on a collision course with the farmers. The soy farmers, the grain farmers, the corn farmers, the wine producers, the fruit farmers, and so forth. And he's also on a collision with Wall Street. Man, you should have seen. We just had Mnuchin on CNBC, and there was a panel of charming ladies, they're commentators, and they're all trying to tear Mnuchin limb from limb. Don't you realize what you're doing to the stock market? Don't you realize what you're doing to our investments? How dare you, Mnuchin, right? And he later on they were amazed that he stood there and took it, even though he's the Secretary of the Treasury. So Trump against China, Trump against the farmers, Trump against Wall Street. This is going to lead to the end of Trump. In other words, it's destroying the hopes of the Republican Party for the November election. And what you're seeing is the Conor Lamb maneuver. Remember Conor Lamb in southwest Pennsylvania? He said, yeah, I'm a Democrat. I support tariffs. I'm supporting protectionism, but vote against this Republican bum, my opponent. You're going to see more and more Democratic congressional candidates say, yeah, we need some tariffs. And some of them will say these things that Trump has done, they're okay, but they're just the beginning. Plus he exempts, right, on the aluminum and steel. He's exempted half the countries involved or more. We want more serious tariffs. The Democrats can go much farther along the tariff road than Trump can. So the Conor Lamb maneuver is going to be imitated, and that is going to contribute, in my view, to the collapse of Trump. In other words, by the time we get to the end of the summer, Trump is going to be Hooverized. The stock market will be shell-shocked. The farmers will be up in arms. The Chinese will be loading on more tariffs and so forth. And Trump is going to take the brunt. What it means simply is that when you've had the entire world for decades going along the path of oligarchy, meaning globalization, globaloney, free trade, and this failed system that we're confronting, to get rid of it is going to, whoever tries to get rid of it is going to pay a price. Going to take a lot of flack. And if you don't know what you're doing, right, there are some people who might know how to bust it up, but they have no idea what to do instead, right? That would be Trump. It's a one-way ticket, and it's a one-way ticket to chaos. So we can't support that. However, if Trump wants to attack the idea of globalization and free trade, great. Evil has often done evil, fought against evil to the benefit of the good. So the hope we have is that this will be, it's a kind of a catharsis of the entire system. Trump against China, Trump against Wall Street, Trump against the farmers, the Democrats being able to come in. The Republicans will not have a leg to stand on because they're going to say, your economic situation is better because of our tax cuts for the rich. And the farmers, the soybean farmers, and the fruit farmers, and the rest of them. This is the California Central Valley. He's going to lose it, right? Look at these people like McCarthy and Congressman Nunes, right? Their constituents, right? Wines, fruits, nuts, soybeans, all the rest of it. They're going to be in big trouble. So we're glad to see this happening. But what Trump represents is dictatorship and war. Unfortunately, we didn't get to how Trump's summit plans with Kim can easily turn into a general war. Go back and listen to that in the daily program. We'll get to it. So we'll see you next week here on World Crisis Radio.